Let's talk about divestment. Yeah, let's talk correctly. Let's talk about investment diversification. Okay. So we talked a little the other day about diversifying your investment portfolio, right? Let me remember why you want to do that. Have investments in several companies across several different industries and economic sectors. Remember why we might want to diversify a portfolio like that? Well, we'll eliminate it, right? But it will reduce it to some degree, right? So if you got oil stocks and there happens to be a hurricane in the Gulf, and that's all you own in your portfolio of oil stocks, your whole portfolio takes a dive, right? But what if you had some other sectors that you invested in the portfolio with a certain weighting, right? Then, well, I go down some, but the other stuff should keep it up, right? So you don't end up in the tank. Does that make sense? Well, okay, so how do we measure risk, right? We can actually mathematically calculate the risk of an investment, right? There are numerical ways to do that. And one way to think about risk is volatility. You've probably seen maybe charts of stocks over years that go up and down and up and down and up and down, right? And that's normal, right? Depending on what's going on in the economy with a particular company. What would you say about a stock that goes up wildly high and wildly low, and wildly high and wildly low over the years, as compared to one that maybe just a little bit average? Well, could you say about the risk in the two stocks? More risk for the one that's wildly going up and down, right? More potential returns, right, on the wild upside, but a whole lot more potential risk on the downside. Exactly right. Yeah, or hold it until it goes to zero, and then you're jumping off a building, right? Yeah. Or panic and sell it at a really low price, and then the next day, after you've sold it, it goes up. Why do they sell it? Take a loss, right? Yeah, it's risky. Okay. So the way we think about the risk of an investment is with the term volatility. How volatile is a stock? Right? Like some people's personality, right? Some people have a volatile, therefore risky personality.
Wait, so once it hits zero, then it's done.
If the stock ever hits zero, that company's pretty much done. That's not a common thing. I mean, you might get that during like the Great Depression, something like that. Yeah, or it might have been, I think, and Ron or somebody in 2008 down to zero, but then the government bailed them out, which I think is a mistake.
So why would they sell it if you look it's going to hit zero?
Well, because they think if it's going to go to zero, they won't get anything at all.
Yeah.
Right? And so you try to sell it and mitigate the loss as much as possible. You're going to take a loss, right? You're thinking, well, all right, so I bought the stock for $50, it's down to $3. If I wait till it's zero, I get nothing. If I sell it now at $3, I get something, right? But then maybe you sold it for the $3, and then a month later it's up at $100. And then you're standing on the ledge of the building again, right? So volatility is a measure of how wildly a stock's value fluctuates, okay? It's a measure of how wildly a stock's value fluctuates over time. Okay, so it's a measure of risk. Okay, it is a risk measure. Okay, now somewhere in algebra or wherever you learn the stuff, you studied statistics a little bit, like mean, median, mode, that kind of thing. So this is the kind of thing you would do here. And you remember, I think you did standard deviation, yeah? Okay, so standard deviation, that's a numerical calculation. Like you take all the closing prices for a stock over the last 5 years, and you want to use a calculator or some computer to get, because it'll be a big calculation, right? But anyway, if you calculate the stock's standard deviation, that is the measure of risk. So if it has a high standard deviation, it's very risky, okay? A low standard deviation, it's not very risky, okay? So we use standard deviation. If you remember, how well was ever explained? Standard deviation is like, so if you take all those closing values, you have an average, right? You can calculate it, you add them all up and divide by however many, right? And you have this average value that it would have over the past 10 years. But from that average line, you know, it's going up and down a certain distance, right? So standard deviation is kind of like the average distance from the average, right? Does that make sense? And if it's average distance from the average is huge, high and low, then it's risky, right? If the average distance is kind of low, kind of stays near over time that average line, right? Then it's not quite as risky, not as many ups and downs, okay? And standard deviation, remember that symbol? Sigma? Yeah, the Greek. That's a sigma, standard deviation. Oh, that's the capital. That's the lowercase sigma. You know, big letters, little letters?
Yeah.
The Greeks did that too. Okay. All right. So it's a standard deviation, right, of closing prices over time. Okay. And of course, the average would be what you're looking at, right, to compare it to. That's that X bar, like the average of the closing values over time, right? And you want to know how wildly does it go above and below that X bar, that average line, okay? So what you have is aggressive investments and conservative investments, right? So aggressive right? Would an aggressive investment be high risk, right? But also what? Potential for what? Sometimes it's wildly higher than average, right? So you have the potential for a higher return, X bar, right? So X bar average, we call that also the return of the stock, right? The expected return, right? Obviously, not necessarily going to be the return, but you would expect the return to be average, whatever the average calculation is, okay? So aggressive would be high risk, which we use standard deviation for, right? And high what? Expected return, right? Higher expected return. The X bar. Okay? So you're not going to take a risk generally, right? Unless you think there's a potential for a higher payback for you. That makes sense? Right? Maybe you jump off a cliff into a river. Pretty risky, but like, what's the return? Like the excitement of it, right? Living on life's edge, adrenaline rush, okay? If it weren't for that adrenaline rush, you'd have no reason to jump off that cliff in the river, would you? No. You just found it boring. Why would I risk breaking my cranium open on those rocks down there?
Why not?
Okay, because that's your cranium, and you need that, generally. I mean, we could hook you up to machines to keep you breathing. You know? All right. But now, a conservative investment would be the opposite, right? That would have a low
standard deviation, right? But then there would be a lower expected return. You agree? I'll just put the symbol in there. We already know what it means, right? Lower X bar. Okay. So for example, my kid's college fund, it's a 529 college fund, right? Invested over the years. And they make it pretty easy. I don't have to, somebody else manages the college fund portfolio, right? They invest it out in the market, the bank does for me. So it's a managed portfolio by someone else. But I get to keep it simple. I get to select like how aggressive do I want to be and how conservative I want to be. So, you know, when the boys were in kindergarten, I could probably afford to be a little more aggressive, right? And take the risk of losing money because I'm going to be in there a lot longer and more likely to go back up if it goes down over time, right? But then as it got close to the time, like within a year of them starting college, what do you think I did? What change do you think I made to that? I went online, I said, okay, let's get a little more conservative with this, right? So I'm not getting as much return on it for that last year, right? But it's safe, right? I don't have to worry about suddenly the money in that account going way down all of a sudden and not being able to pay the tuition. Does that make sense? So the closer you are to needing the money, probably the more conservative you want to be, and vice versa. Okay? We're not going to get into betas and stuff. Oh, should we talk about stock betas? No, we're not going to do the portfolio thing. If we're doing the portfolio, we'd be calculating sigmas, betas, PE ratios, and all that fun stuff. I mean, it is, man. It's good stuff to know. And they also address liquidity in there. What is liquidity? I don't want to write it down. It's in the book. Yeah, it's the ability to turn something into cash, right? Liquid is actual cash. You know, capital is like any asset, right? But so, like, if I had cash in my pocket, that's as liquid as it gets, right? If I need cash and I have to sell my truck's not very liquid, but I could sell it, liquidate it, and convert it to cash, right? That makes sense? You know, something else that would be less liquid would be what? Like your house. It's tougher to sell, takes longer, right? It's more difficult to convert to cash, to liquidate. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. And so sometimes in your portfolio, you do want to have some cash value in there that's liquid, right? Because you may need access to it, right? Which is not necessarily an investment. You're actually losing money if you just have cash. You know that? Do we know why? Like if you keep your money under your mattress, you're not earning any interest on it, you're losing value. Why would you actually lose value? Inflation. Inflation. There's an inflation rate, right? Usually hangs around recently like 3%, right? So your money is losing 3% of its value every year. So things generally cost more. It is not a problem until like incomes start to not keep up with inflation too, right? When that happens, you get the stagflation thing, and that happened in the 70s, where the value of the dollar dropped, right? But then income didn't rise commensurately with it, right? So inflation is not the worst thing in the world as long as incomes are part of it. Anyway, so, and by the way, your portfolio, you know how your grades are a weighted average of tests, quizzes, homework, right? So how do I calculate the grade, right? Let's say I take, you don't need to write this down, let's go on another page. Let's say I have tests, I don't remember what I had in here, 40%, good grief, 40%, and I don't know, homework at, let's call it 30%, what's that, 70? In quizzes, I weight at the other 30, right? So let's say just your homework average is 100. Or your test, yeah, I meant the other way. Let's say your test average is 95, right? And your homework average is 100, right? And you have a quiz average of 85. Well, I don't just add those up and divide by 3, do I? Because they're not equally weighted, right? So what do? I take this test average and multiply it by what? 0.4, and the homework average by 0.3, and this one by the other 0.3, right? Well, let's do that real quick. Somebody, you guys do it. Just get your calculator. What's 95 times 0.4?
Yeah, I want to see it, but.
Should be 40 something. 38. So 38%, right? So that's the weighted average there. And what's the weighted grade of the homework? Oh, come on. Yeah, that's 30. And the test? Now add all those up. What do you got? Just add those.
93.
So that's your overall grade. See, that's a weighted average of those components, right? And I think you kind of knew how that worked, but weren't quite clear. That's exactly how it goes. Weighted average. You can't just divide by 3 again, right? Because I would assume they're all weighted the same, right? But this is called a weighted average. Now your portfolio, when you're diversified, you're not necessarily putting the same amount of money into every different type of stock category. You're weighting it at certain percentages, right? You're evaluating, you know, the risk of saying, oh, this is pretty risky, so maybe I only want to have 10% of my portfolio here. And this one is safer, right? So maybe I'm going to have 40% invested in this stuff, and it's all right. And so you can take a weighted average of those returns to get your portfolio return, which is like your overall grade, right? Go back here. So let's look then. Example 1. So I think example 2 does the weighted average, but anyway, take a look at example 1. Simone, would you read that for us, please, when I'm writing this?
In order planning to invest $90,000 per year for 6 years, she plans on investing 20% into a growth stock, 25% into an income stock, 15% into corporate bonds, and the remainder in a 10-year certificate of deposit. How much money will she be allocated to each category?
Okay. Well, we have all the percentages but one, don't we? Which one do we not have? The CDs, right? We could figure that out, couldn't we? We need that. So the CDs. So 100% minus all those other percents, right? What were they? 20, 25, and 15? And you should get CDs are weighted at 40%. So now we have all the percentages, right? Want to see how to get that part there? Okay. So let's figure out, so we basically have to do a weighted average here, okay? A weighted average. So let's do, you got $90,000, right? Let's see. Times, right. So 20% of that 90 is in growth, right? So let's take our weighted average and spin this down. So let's do 90K times 20%, 0.2, right? Plus 90,000 times what? 25%, right? You follow me here? Plus 90K times 15.15. And 90K times for the CDs, right? Plus 90K or 40% of that. Right? I think the book might have set it up a little better than we did. I think they did them all one at a time. Well, what did they ask here? Oh, they wanted, okay, so maybe I should have done it like the book, because they want how much to each one. So let's just write it out. What's 90K times 0.2? No, you don't. Just leave it like this. All is not lost. 18,000. So this is 18,000. And what was that in? That's in the growth stocks. plus, and the income stock's 22.5, right? That's our income stock. And then the times 0.15 is 13.5. What was that in? That was in corporate bonds. And then the CDs is going to be 36,000. And that's the CDs. Okay. So let's verify that adds up to 90,000, shall we? That goes up. Should add to 90,000. But this is really the answer they were looking for. Okay? So that's the weighted investments, right? But then, you know, if we knew what the actual percent return or yield or return was on each one of those, we can now, just like we did your overall course rate, find out the weighted average of return for like the whole portfolio. So the portfolio return. By the way, I'm going to remember that sigma notation for the summation. Are we adding things here, guys? Yeah, right? So we could use the sigma to represent adding a whole lot of things. So let's take a look at example 2. Simone, can you read that? Is this like the same example extended?
Some of the investments were in speculative stocks. Speculative stocks are not new, they're not very risky. Relative that you will not lose some security.
Yeah, so just the speculative investments would be kind of like aggressive investments.
If the corporate bonds spend a total of 8%, the relevant income stocks are 21%, the CDs are 2%. The speculative stocks lose 88% of their value, and the checking account grows 1%. Read the net monetary loss.
So in other words, I want you to compute, and I wish I'd worded it this way, the portfolio return as a whole, okay? Think of it as your overall average in class, all right? We want to compute the portfolio return. Okay, so I'm gonna lay this on you here. So I'm gonna give you an equation with that sigma summation thing in there. And I'm gonna write this down. R sub P. You could probably guess what that stands for, the return of what? Portfolio, right? Is going to equal the sum. Right, remember that from the other day? As I goes from 1 to n, the little index here, to n, and we have to show how we multiply by everything's weighted average here, right? So I want to do R sub I, which I mean to be the return on a particular investment, one little investment inside the portfolio. And I need to multiply them each by their weighting. You know, like homework was 30%, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so the R sub I, you might think is one of them is homework, the other one's tests, the other one's quizzes, right? Okay, and I'm going to multiply these by W sub I, which you could probably guess is the weight of each. Is anybody blown away by that? You can kind of get an idea what that all means? What's the R sub P? That's the overall return, right? That's the portfolio return. R sub I would be an investment return, and like in each individual one, right? Because there's a lot of things in the problem she's investing in, right? This is every individual little thing. Investment return of each individual one. And the W sub I is just the weighting. Golly. Ugh. Slow down, Mr. Hefner. W-E-I-G, sound it out. E of each investment. And again, that sigma just means I'm gonna multiply every one of these two values and then do what to all of those? Add them all up, like we did up here. Okay? So you learn some new notation. So let's run this through here then. So I better start way over to the left because this could get long. Our portfolio return in this particular case, expanding that out, would be, so we have 8%, and by the way they work this out in the example in the book is riddled with errors. I would recommend, if you ever go back and look at this one, look at my notes for it, because they've got typed it. It's almost incomprehensible what they've done. So anyway, I'm going to simplify it. So for the first thing, see the investment. So let's take a look at, where was it? What's that in purple? Corporate bonds. What are the corporate bonds weighted? Okay, and what's the return? 8%, right? So if you see in that pie chart, that's the weighting of each, yes? Okay, and they told us what the return of each is, right? So the corporate bonds, we're going to do 0.08. That's the return, right? Yeah, that's the return. And it's weighted, what's the W for the corporate bonds? 10%, right? You with me on that? Let's just go around the graph here. The next one is 28, right? What's the next, the light one? The growth in income stocks. What was their return? What? The growth in income. What was the return for that?
21%.
So 0.21 times the growth in income weighting from the pie chart was what? 0.28, you with me? Plus, we can do, what's the one that's in yellow, which the CDs. What's the return on the CDs? That's the weighting. That's how much, 2%, right? So 0.02 times their weight in the portfolio, 0.4, right? You kind of getting the idea here what we do? Now, what's the one that had a negative? The speculative stocks lost. So I'm still going to add here, right? Because I'm doing some, but I'm going to add a negative just to be mathematically correct. How much did the stocks lose? What was their return? So negative 0.88. Negative 0.88. And what was their weighting in the portfolio? 0.90%? 0.09, right? Luckily, it's not weighted very high. See what I'm getting at? So if that portfolio was just all these stocks that lost that much value, you're in trouble with your portfolio. But all this other stuff's keeping it afloat, right? I think we had one more thing to put in there. What's the one up there? Checking accounts. There's like no risk at all with those, right? But they get paid a little interest. And what was the return on the checking? 1%? And their weighting was, no, it wasn't, 13%. Yeah. Okay, so this is like calculating your final grade, right? Test, quizzes, homework, but there's a few more things, right? You kind of get the idea, this weighted average stuff? Okay. And so what is the overall portfolio return? Calculate that out. somebody's calculating. Negative 0.0031. But let's make that a percent. What would that be as a percent? Move it back this way twice. Yeah, so negative 0.31%. So it lost. Less than a percent, right? Not much, like a third of a percent. How much would those speculative stocks down? They lost what percent? 88%? So part of your portfolio lost 88%, but look what diversification does for you. You only overall dropped 0.31%. So diversifying is really important, wouldn't you think? Yeah. But what's the actual net loss? How do we find out the net loss? Like the dollar value of the loss. What was the original value? How much did she invest altogether? 90,000. Right, so that's the percent loss, right? That's the return of negative 0.31%. And so if we do negative 0.31, oh no, we need more of a decimal, right? So negative 0.0031 times 90,000. How much did she lose dollar-wise here? So negative 279 loss, right? Now, they go, oh, it's a loss, right? So they call it, remember, that's an unrealized loss. It's only a loss on paper right now. When would it become a realized loss? When she decides to sell it at this value, then it becomes, and then you have negative income, basically, or negative net worth. But for right now, it's just what's called a paper loss. A little of that, not a little bit. Right? Yeah, we're almost there. Example 3. Almost. Well, what did you think? Oh. All right. Somebody. Anyway, let's go over example 3. Don't read that, will you? Well, we're going to stop at example 4. That's why I said we're almost done. Read example 3.
Claire has $12,000. She would like to invest for the next 4 years. The searchers 240 shares slack the maximum appropriation first. Annual dividend is 1.84 per share.
Okay. So, he didn't really tell us what he wants us to do. Put down in the middle there. It says in 4 years, Claire will sell the stock. It could go down in price. If she sells it for $10,500, how much did she gain or lose over the 4 years? Well, we need like net proceeds here, right? So we need to figure out what she spent out to buy it, right? Makes sense? And then what she brought in after she sold it. And then what should we add to that to figure out her net proceeds? Oh, I already covered that one. What else happens? Don't they pay dividends? Yeah, so we have to figure out the dividends for 4 years and add that in, right? So basically, the net proceeds are just the amount of money you spent, you got back, and the difference between the two, right? Net proceeds. So let's figure out the 4 years worth of dividends. This is what, example 3? So how much were the dividends? $1.84 per share. How many shares did she get? So the dividend, she had 240 stocks. They got $1.84 each for how long? For 4 years. So she received little over $1,700 in dividends. So I think it's 1766. Okay, so that's money that came to her. So we got to figure out what money she spent, what money she brought in. So let's look at net proceeds. So her net proceeds. All right, so she sold the stocks for how much? How much was it? I'm sorry. 10,500, right? So that was money coming to her. So that's positive number to her, right? So she sold them for 10,500. But originally she purchased them for how much? So that was money going away from her. So what do you think we do with the 12,000? Subtract it. Minus 12,000. And then she had, in the meantime, money coming back to her, which was what? The total of all the dividends. So we add that. Right? You get how that works? If it's money coming to you, it's positive. If it's money you're paying, it's negative. It's subtracted. Okay? So that should come. So this is just a little subnote here. This is from the sale. This is from the purchase. And this is from the dividends. I believe that comes to 266.40. Right? That's all messed up. Come on, come on, come on. Stupid thing. Why? There we go. So what? Let's figure out then her annualized, like the effective annual return from this investment. Right? As a percent. How do we find percent? Whole over what? Part over whole times 100. Right? So we could find the annualized return by taking this part, which is what? And what would be the whole? What she spent for it? 12,000, right? So let's take that. 266.40 divided by 12,000 times 100. What's that give you? .2%. Okay. So you get the idea there. Net proceeds is just like the sum of all the money going away from you and coming to you. If it's going away from you, it's what? If you are spending money from your checking account, what do you do to your checking account balance? Subtract that negative, right? If money's coming to you, it's positive, right? It's simple calculation. All right? One more example. Number 4. But I want to talk about opportunity cost. We'll address it. The concept of opportunity cost in World Finance is pretty important. Right? So let me just anybody ever heard this term before? All right. So if I invest in a particular investment and I get some particular return out of that, right? I've invested my money in it, okay? But did I give up the opportunity to invest in something else other than that? I did, right? Whatever you invest in, right? There's always something else you could have invested in, right? You had an opportunity for something else. And so basically, the thing that, whatever the return is on the thing that you didn't invest in, that's the opportunity cost. You gave up that potential return for the one you chose.
And that actually, opportunity cost is kind of the thing that you can apply to almost anything in your life, right?
When you got up and you made the decision today to come to school, what was the opportunity cost of that decision? What? No, that's the return on it. What else could you have done that would have had some benefit to you other than getting up and coming? Yeah, the opportunity cost was staying in bed all day. See what I mean? So you made a decision, right? And you had to give up the staying in bed part for coming here. You made the right call, I would say. Right? Do you think so? Yeah, I think so. Okay. So opportunity cost is just choosing one investment, foregoing the potential return of another. Okay? So it's choosing one investment foregoing the potential return of another. All right. I have another example you might think about opportunity cost.
Have any of your parents, because, you know, interest rates are so incredibly low these days, have any of your parents maybe refinanced a mortgage on their home? Get a better rate? Okay, right, so they refinanced the mortgage on their home, to get a lower rate. There's an opportunity cost, with that. Let's say that, instead of doing that, maybe they reduced their interest rate on the mortgage to 2%, but they could have used their resources to take their cash, you know, with all the closing costs, and invest that cash in something that earned 8%. But you're only saving 2% on your mortgage, right? So there's an opportunity. So you have to decide, right, like how much lower the interest rates have to go before I decide to refinance and not spend my money on something else and get a return. Does that make sense to you? What's another example of opportunity? Like if interest rates are only down 0.5%, most people don't bother refinance because there's costs, right? There's closing costs, thousands of dollars to do that, right? And you could use that $1,000 elsewhere to earn a higher return than what you're gaining on the. Yeah. Anyway, so example 4 then. Mercedes, read.
Compare Claire's investment from example 3 in the check your understanding to her keeping the money in a CD that paid 3% interest.
So-
Compounded
Okay, so instead of that other investment, right, she gave up the opportunity to invest in a CD at what percent? 3%, right? So that's an opportunity cost she gave up. So like calculate, they're not saying it, but they're asking you to actually calculate the opportunity cost of her decision back in example 3 to not invest in the CD. So let's see what she could have gained from the CD, right? Now it's compounded continuously, remember? Got to use this, right? To get the return on the CD, okay? So how much money did she have? 12,000, wasn't it? So the amount she could have earned on a CD was that 12,000 times E. What's our R for the CD? The rate?
0%.
0.03 times what? How many years was it? It was 4 years, wasn't it? Right, you guys know what E is, right? The natural logarithmic number, Euler's number. It's like pi, but it's E. It's different. So push buttons, tell me what you get. would she have gotten? Mm, 0.96, right? Okay, so let's figure out the return on that CD. Part over whole. We got to figure out what the part was. What was her gain on the CD? If 12,000 became 13.5, what was her gain on the CD? So you just do 13.5, right? 29.96 minus 12,000, and Dylan, you're about to say it. So that's what she could have gained on the CD. So let's get the return for that. Now we do the part over whole. Part over whole is this over what? Over the 12,000 times 100. And what would be the return on that CD? %12.7%. Now, that's for 4 years. So let's annualize that. So if that's for 4 years, what do we do? What? Divide it by 4. So annualize it. It's 12.7 divided by 4, 3.2% annually. Okay, that would be the annual return on the CD. Right? As compared to what in the other investment? What was it? 2.2%. So maybe she should have opted for the CD right from the get-go. Right? Did she get a little more? Would have gotten a little more return out of that? Okay. Have I blown anybody's brain holes away here? Well, that was quite a bit. Example 4 is the last one we're going to do there. So